It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a simple trip that he'd taken 100 times before. Just the guys, he'd said. We'll go out, shoot some deer, drink a few beers, and come back by Sunday. I didn't think much of it when he kissed me goodbye. His usual easy smile on his lips, gun case slung over his shoulder. He looked like the man I'd married, the man I trusted. But that was before. That was when I still believed him. I don't know why, but this time felt different. A strange unease settled over me as soon as he left. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact as he headed out the door, or how his hug felt just a bit too hurried, too forced. I shook it off at first, telling myself I was overthinking things. It wasn't until I found the text on his phone that night that my entire world came crashing down. His phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter while I was making tea, and for a moment I didn't even think to look. But then out of sheer reflex I glanced down and there it was. A message from a number I didn't recognize. Miss you already. Can't wait for tomorrow night. I felt my heart stop, the cup slipping from my hands and shattering on the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I read it over and over again, hoping that somehow I'd misunderstood. Maybe it was a joke, a misunderstanding, something innocent that didn't mean what I thought it did. But deep down I knew. The text wasn't from one of his friends. It wasn't innocent. I grabbed his phone, my hands trembling, and scrolled through the messages. I knew it was wrong, I knew it was invasive, but I couldn't stop myself. And there it was, days, weeks, months of messages. The name was saved as Sarah, but I had never heard of any Sarah. Flirty texts, secret plans, explicit promises for what they would do when they finally got the chance to be alone. It wasn't just a fling. This had been going on for a while. My stomach churned as I scrolled back, reading every message, every confession of lust and longing. My legs gave out and I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, barely able to breathe through the sobs that shook my body. The man I loved, the man I had built my life around, was with someone else. And not just anyone. Sarah wasn't just a random woman. She was his colleague, someone he had casually mentioned a few times over the years, just enough for me to recognize her name but not enough for me to think twice about it. I had trusted him, I had trusted our life together. And all the while, he had been sneaking around behind my back, using his hunting trips as an excuse to see her. I don't know how long I sat there paralyzed with grief and anger. Time seemed to stop as the weight of it all crashed down on me. How could I have been so blind? How could I not have seen this coming? All those weekends when he had gone away, all those nights he had come home late from work, tired and distant. It had all been right in front of me, but I hadn't wanted to see it. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, though that was enough to tear me apart. It was the lies, the carefully constructed facade of our marriage that I had believed in for so long, crumbling before my eyes. He had lied to me with every kiss, every smile, every promise of forever. I had loved him with everything I had, and in return he had given a part of himself to someone else. I wanted to scream, to break something, to confront him right then and there. But I knew he wouldn't answer. He was out hunting, probably in some cabin with her, laughing at how easy it had been to fool me. My hand shook as I dialed his number, the phone ringing endlessly until it went to voicemail. I hung up, unable to listen to his voice, the voice that now felt like a stranger's. The man I thought I knew, the man I had shared my life with, was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who could lie to me so easily, who could smile at me and tell me he loved me while sneaking off to be with her. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, his hands on her the way they used to be on me. I imagined them tangled in bed, laughing at how oblivious I had been, how stupid I must have seemed. I hated him. I hated her. But more than anything, I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, drained from the hours of crying and replaying every moment of our marriage in my mind. I knew what I had to do, but I dreaded it. I had to confront him. I had to hear him admit it, hear him say the words out loud. I waited for him to come home, every second feeling like an eternity. When I heard the familiar sound of his truck pulling into the driveway, my heart raced. I didn't know how I would do it, how I would find the strength to confront him without breaking down completely. But I had no choice. He walked through the door, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Hey babe," he said, setting his bag down on the floor. "Miss me?" The rage bubbled up inside me, hot and uncontrollable. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Who is she? I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. His smile faltered, confusion flashing across his face. What are you talking about? He asked, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Sarah. I spat the name like poison. Don't lie to me. I know everything. His face went pale, and for a moment we just stood there, the silence between us louder than any words. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. How long? I demanded. How long have you been lying to me? He looked down, unable to meet my eyes. It's not what you think, he started, but I couldn't listen. I couldn't hear any more lies. Don't, I whispered, my voice breaking. Just don't. I turned away from him, unable to bear the sight of the man I thought I loved. The man who had destroyed everything we had built together. The man who had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And in that moment I knew that our marriage was over. There was no coming back from this. No apology, no explanation could ever fix what he had broken. He had taken my trust, my love, and shattered it beyond repair. As I walked away, I felt the weight of his betrayal press down on me. But I also felt something else. A strange sense of relief. The truth was out. The lies were over. And as painful as it was, at least now I knew. At least now I could begin to heal. But I would never forgive him. Not for this. Not for breaking my heart in the cruelest way imaginable. He tried to stop me as I walked toward the stairs, his hand reaching out to grasp my arm. Wait, please, just let me explain, he begged, his voice tight with desperation. I flinched at his touch, jerking my arm out of his grasp as if his skin had burned mine. The anger roared back to life inside me, even fiercer than before. Explain, I hissed, spinning around to face him. Explain what? How you've been screwing around with her for months. How you lied to my face every time you left for these so-called hunting trips. Do you think there's anything you can say that will make this better? His lips parted, but no words came out. He looked helpless, small, shrinking under the weight of the truth. Good. Let him feel that for once, the crushing guilt, the overwhelming sense of loss. I wanted him to feel the pain that was tearing me apart. The anguish of knowing that the person you trusted most in the world had betrayed you in the most intimate way. How long? I asked again, my voice quieter now, but no less deadly. I needed to know. I needed to hear him say it, to confirm the timeline of his deceit. His eyes dropped to the floor, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he did. 6 months, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's been going on for 6 months. 6 months. I staggered back, the room spinning around me. 6 months of lies. 6 months of him coming home to me, kissing me, telling me he loved me, while he was sneaking off to be with her. My chest tightened and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The betrayal was so much deeper than I had imagined. He had lived 2 lives for half a year, and I had been oblivious the entire time. How could you? I choked out, tears burning at the back of my eyes again. How could you do this to me? To us? He finally looked up, his face contorted with shame. I don't know, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. It just happened. I never meant for it to go this far. I didn't want to hurt you. I laughed then, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the house. You didn't want to hurt me? You've been sneaking around with her for 6 months, and you're telling me you didn't want to hurt me? What did you think would happen? That I just never find out? That we could go on like this forever? I was going to end it, he said quickly, his voice rising with urgency. I swear I was. I didn't know how to stop, but I knew it couldn't go on like this. I didn't want to lose you. It was amazing how those words, those pathetic, cowardly words, could feel like a knife twisting in my chest. He had been having an affair, lying to me day after day, and now he wanted credit for thinking about ending it? For sparing me from the pain of finding out? You already lost me, I said quietly, each word a struggle to get out. The moment you started this with her, you lost me. And you didn't care enough to stop. The silence between us was deafening. The weight of our shattered relationship pressing down on both of us. I could see the panic in his eyes, the desperation as he tried to figure out what to say to make this better, to undo the damage he had done. But there was nothing he could say. There was no fixing this. I'll leave, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the heavy silence. I'll go. I don't want to make this worse for you. I'll give you space. I shook my head, the anger rising in me again. Oh, now you're doing me a favor? Now you want to be the good guy and give me space? You should have thought about that 6 months ago. He looked wounded, but I didn't care. He deserved every bit of pain I was throwing at him. I wanted him to suffer, to feel the depth of my betrayal. But at the same time, I didn't want to be in the same room as him for another second. His presence was suffocating me, reminding me of every lie, every time he had kissed me with her on his mind. I couldn't bear it. Just go, I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the emotion I was holding back. I can't look at you right now. I need you to go. For a moment he didn't move, like he was hoping I would change my mind, that somehow I would soften and let him stay. But then he seemed to realize that I wasn't going to. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and turned to leave. As he walked toward the door, I watched him go, my heart a tangled mess of fury and sadness. When the door finally clicked shut behind him, I collapsed onto the couch, my body shaking with sobs I could no longer hold back. The reality of what had just happened settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My marriage, the life I had built with him, was over. I felt like I was drowning in grief, gasping for air as the pain of his betrayal washed over me again and again. I don't know how long I sat there, curled up on the couch, crying until my throat was raw and my body ached. Time seemed meaningless in the wake of what had just happened. Everything felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, the sobs slowed and a numbness crept in, dulling the edges of my pain. I couldn't cry anymore. Couldn't feel anything except the hollow emptiness that had settled in my chest. I wiped at my swollen eyes and forced myself to sit up. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what to do next. The house felt so quiet, so empty without him in it. The same house that had once felt warm and safe now felt like a prison, filled with the echoes of everything that had been lost. I glanced around, my eyes landing on his things. His jacket draped over the chair, his boots by the door, the picture of us on the mantel from our wedding day. My stomach twisted at the sight, and I quickly looked away. I couldn't bear to see those reminders of a life that was gone. I needed to get out. I needed to escape, even if just for a little while. The walls were closing in on me, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Grabbing my coat and keys, I fled the house, barely pausing to lock the door behind me. The cool evening air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it did nothing to ease the storm raging inside me. I didn't know where I was going. I just started driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The road blurred in front of me as I drove aimlessly through town, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quiet. How long had he been lying to me, really? Was it only 6 months, or had there been others before her? I felt sick thinking about it. Every moment of our life together now felt like a lie. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered word of love seemed tainted by his betrayal. I couldn't trust any of it anymore. I couldn't trust him anymore. I drove until the streets became unfamiliar, the city lights fading behind me as the highway stretched out into the dark. I didn't care where I ended up. I just wanted to run, to get as far away from the pain as I could, even though I knew I couldn't outrun it. It was inside me, lodged deep in my chest, and no matter how far I drove, it would still be there. At some point, I pulled over onto the side of the road, my head resting against the steering wheel as the tears started up again, hot and unstoppable. I cried for everything, for the love I had lost, for the life that would never be the same, for the trust that had been shattered. And as the tears fell, I wondered how I would ever put the pieces of myself back together. How I would ever find a way to move forward when everything I thought I knew had been ripped away. I stayed there for what felt like hours, until the tears finally dried up and the numbness returned. There was nothing left in me now, just emptiness. I don't know how long I sat there, on the side of that empty highway, staring out into the night as if the darkness could somehow swallow up the pain inside me. The sky was clear, the stars cold and distant, so unlike the way I felt. I had always loved the night, the way it wrapped around you like a blanket, offering quiet and stillness. But now it felt like a vast, uncaring void, just like him. Eventually, the numbness settled in again, and I realized I couldn't stay there forever. I didn't want to go home, back to that house filled with memories that now felt like ghosts, but I had nowhere else to go. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and I let out a long, shaky breath before turning the key in the ignition and pulling back onto the road. The drive back felt like sleepwalking. My mind somewhere far away, my body moving out of pure necessity. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed in front of me like some sort of haunted monument to the life I thought I had. His truck wasn't there. Good. I didn't want to see him. I wasn't ready for that confrontation again. I didn't know if I would ever be ready. The weight of everything settled back on my chest as I stepped inside, locking the door behind me with a sense of finality, as if I were locking out the world and maybe, just maybe, the pain would stay outside too. But of course it didn't. It followed me inside, clinging to me like a second skin. I dropped my keys onto the kitchen counter, the same spot where I'd found his phone earlier that night. The phone that had shattered my entire reality in a single moment. My eyes fell on it again, and I felt a fresh wave of nausea roll through me. How could something so small, a simple text message, unravel everything? How could one little device hold the power to destroy an entire marriage? Before I could stop myself, I reached for the phone. It was like picking at a wound, knowing it would hurt but unable to resist. My fingers shook as I unlocked it, the messages between him and Sarah still glaring back at me, as if they were mocking me for not seeing it sooner. I scrolled through them again, even though every word felt like a fresh stab to the heart. Can't wait to see you again. Last weekend was amazing. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would erase the images the words conjured in my mind. I imagined them together, sneaking off during one of his hunting trips. Their laughter, their touches, their whispered secrets. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just the physical act of cheating. It was the lies, the deception, the emotional connection he had with her. That was what gutted me the most. He had given her a part of himself that was supposed to belong to me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, to shatter it into as many pieces as it had shattered me. But instead, I just placed it back down on the counter, my hand trembling as I pulled away from it like it was some poisonous thing. I couldn't stay in the kitchen. The air felt too thick, the walls too close. I needed to get away from the reminders of everything. So I headed upstairs, my feet dragging with exhaustion, my body heavy with the weight of what I had uncovered. Our bedroom door was open, and I hesitated at the threshold, feeling a strange sense of dread. This room, our room, felt different now, tainted. I stepped inside, and the scent of him still lingered, faint but undeniable. His side of the bed was exactly as he had left it, his pillow slightly dented, the blankets messy from where he'd thrown them back before leaving. I stared at it, the mundane evidence of his presence, and my stomach churned again. The bed had once been a place of comfort, of intimacy, of shared moments that had made me feel safe and loved. Now it felt like a stranger's bed, like everything that had happened in it had been a lie. I couldn't bring myself to lie down in it, not when it felt like he had already invited someone else into that space, even if she had never physically been there. Instead, I sat down in the corner of the room, pulling my knees to my chest, as if curling into myself could somehow protect me from the overwhelming storm of emotions crashing through me. I felt small, like a child hiding from a monster she couldn't see but knew was lurking in the shadows. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel that pure burning rage that had surged through me when I'd first confronted him. But instead, all I felt now was hollow. Like I had given so much of myself to him, to our marriage, that there was nothing left. I had trusted him with everything I had, and now I had no idea who I was without that trust. Without him. I stayed like that for hours, maybe even longer. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, blurring at the edges as I sat in the dark, my mind replaying every moment of our relationship, trying to find the signs I had missed. Had I been a fool all along? Had I been so blinded by love that I couldn't see what was right in front of me? Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have fallen asleep right there on the floor. When I woke up, the first rays of morning light were creeping through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. My body ached from sleeping in such an awkward position, but that was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. That was deeper, more permanent. I sat there for a long time, staring out the window as the world came to life outside. Cars drove by, birds sang. People went about their lives as if everything was normal. But my life had been ripped apart, and nothing felt normal anymore. I didn't know how to move forward. I didn't know what my life looked like without him. But I had to do something. I couldn't sit here forever, paralyzed by the weight of my own grief. I needed to make a decision. I needed to figure out what came next. I got up slowly, every muscle in my body protesting as I stretched and made my way to the bathroom. My reflection in the mirror startled me. My eyes were swollen from crying, my hair a tangled mess, my skin pale and blotchy. I looked like a ghost of myself, like someone I barely recognized. I turned away from the mirror quickly, not wanting to confront that reality just yet. Instead, I focused on small practical things. I splashed cold water on my face, brushed my teeth, combed my hair. Each action felt like a tiny step toward reclaiming some control, no matter how insignificant. I couldn't control what he had done, but I could control what I did next. As I got dressed, I found myself thinking about our wedding day. How beautiful and hopeful everything had seemed then. I had looked into his eyes, believing that we were starting a life together, building something that would last forever. I had never imagined it would end like this, with lies and betrayal and a shattered heart. I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at the neatly hung clothes, the rows of shoes, the little pieces of my life that now seemed meaningless. I reached out, my fingers brushing over the fabric of one of his shirts that hung on the far end of the rack. For a moment I considered pulling it off the hanger, burying my face in it and inhaling his scent, as if that would somehow bring him back to the man I thought he was. But I stopped myself. No. I couldn't cling to the past anymore. The man I had loved was gone. Or maybe he had never existed. Maybe he had just been a version of himself that he had shown me, while hiding the truth of who he really was. I pulled my hand back and closed the closet door, shutting away that part of my life for now. I wasn't ready to confront it yet. Instead, I headed downstairs, my steps slow and deliberate as I tried to figure out what to do next. Every corner of the house felt like a reminder of him, of everything that was now broken. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the phone on the counter again. Should I call someone? A friend, maybe? But I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain what had happened, to relive the pain again by putting it into words. Not yet. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my keys and left the house. I didn't know where I was going, just that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Every room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me, whispering reminders of the betrayal I had uncovered. The air outside was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the heaviness in my chest. It felt like fall had fully settled in. The trees lining the street ablaze with vibrant reds and oranges. A beautiful sight, but in that moment I couldn't appreciate it. Nothing could break through the numbness I felt. I got into my car and started driving, my mind too cluttered to form a plan, my body moving on autopilot. The hum of the engine, the feel of the road beneath me. It was all just noise, white noise that kept me from spiraling further into the depths of my grief. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles pale as I navigated through the familiar streets. The same streets I had driven down countless times, on my way to pick up groceries or head to work or meet him for dinner. Streets that had once felt so normal, so ordinary, now felt like part of some distant, unfamiliar world. I wasn't sure how long I drove before I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a small park on the edge of town. It was quiet here, isolated, just what I needed. I parked the car and sat for a moment, staring out at the empty playground in front of me. The swings swayed slightly in the breeze, creaking softly, the kind of sound that might have once brought a sense of peace. Now it just added to the eerie silence that filled my head. I got out of the car and wandered over to one of the benches, the cold metal seeping through my clothes as I sat down. I wrapped my arms around myself, hugging my body tightly as if trying to keep the pieces of me from falling apart. The emptiness inside me was overwhelming. I had never felt so alone, so completely abandoned, even though the world continued on around me, oblivious to the devastation I was living through. I thought about calling someone, my sister maybe, or my best friend Lauren. But every time I reached for my phone I hesitated. What would I even say? How could I put into words the sheer depth of my pain? How could I explain what had happened without breaking down completely? I wasn't ready for the questions, the pity, the well-meaning advice about how time heals all wounds. I knew they would mean well, but no amount of comforting words could erase the truth. The man I had loved, the man I had trusted with my whole heart, had betrayed me, and I didn't know how to move forward from that. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind a blur of thoughts and memories, each one more painful than the last. I replayed our wedding day in my head again, The way he had looked at me as I walked down the aisle, his eyes filled with love and promise. I had believed in that promise. I had believed in him. And now it felt like all of it had been a lie. The tears started to fall again, silent and unrelenting, dripping down my cheeks and onto my lap. I didn't bother wiping them away. What was the point? I had no more strength left to pretend I was okay, to try and hold it together. Out here in the quiet of the park, with no one around to see me, I could finally let myself fall apart. I leaned forward, burying my face in my hands, the sobs racking my body with a force I hadn't known was still inside me. I had thought I had cried all I could, but the grief was endless, bottomless. It poured out of me in waves, raw and overwhelming. My chest ached with the force of it, my throat tight and sore from holding it all in for so long. For the first time since finding those messages, I allowed myself to admit the truth. My marriage was over. There was no fixing this. No amount of apologies or explanations could undo the damage he had done. He had taken our life together, the love we had built, and destroyed it. And now I had to figure out what to do next, how to rebuild myself from the rubble of what we had been. Eventually, the sobs slowed, and I was left with nothing but the quiet, the stillness that followed the storm. My body felt heavy, exhausted, as if the grief had drained every last bit of energy from me. I sat there for a while longer, my mind blank, my heart numb. I didn't know what time it was, didn't care. The park was empty, save for a few birds fluttering from tree to tree, their songs muted against the backdrop of my despair. As the day wore on, I forced myself to stand up, my legs shaky as I made my way back to the car. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I needed to keep moving, to do something, anything, to keep myself from sinking further into the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. I drove again, this time without any real direction, just letting the road take me wherever it led. My mind was still numb, still reeling from the enormity of everything that had happened. I felt disconnected from the world around me, like I was watching my life from a distance, unable to fully comprehend that this was real, that this was my life. Eventually, I ended up at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place I used to go when I needed a break from everything. I hadn't been here in months, not since before all of this. It felt strange to walk in, to see the familiar faces of the baristas who had no idea what had just happened to me. To them, I was just another customer, just another person coming in for a cup of coffee. They didn't know that my world had fallen apart. I ordered a coffee and found a seat by the window, the warmth of the cup in my hands a small comfort against the cold that had settled inside me. I sipped it slowly, staring out at the street, watching people go about their day as if nothing had changed. For them it hadn't. Life moved on even when your heart was breaking. I couldn't sit still though. My thoughts wouldn't stop spinning, circling back to the same place. What now? I didn't want to think about him anymore, but how could I not? Every second felt like I was reliving the moment I had found out, over and over like a cruel loop I couldn't escape. I wanted to ask him why. Why had he done this to us? To me? Wasn't I enough? Was our life not enough? I found myself pulling out my phone again, my thumb hovering over his number. I wanted to call him, to scream at him, to demand answers. But I couldn't. What would be the point? He would just lie again, try to explain it all away, try to say it wasn't as bad as I thought. But it was. It was worse than anything I could have imagined. Instead, I opened the messages between him and Sarah again, reading through them one last time, as if I needed the pain to fully sink in, to become real. Each word was a knife slicing deeper, confirming everything I had feared. There was no coming back from this. I deleted the conversation, my fingers shaking as I pressed the button. It felt final, like I was cutting away a part of myself, a part of my life. But it needed to be done. I couldn't keep torturing myself with it. I sat there for a long time, my coffee growing cold in my hands, my mind blank. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay in that house. Not with the memories, the reminders of him everywhere. I needed to leave, to get away from everything. And so, I made a decision. I would pack a bag and I would leave. I didn't know where I would go yet. Maybe to my sister's, maybe just to a hotel for a few nights, but I needed space. I needed distance. From him, from the life we had built, from the pain that was suffocating me. With a new sense of purpose, I stood up, tossed my cold coffee in the trash, and headed back to the car. The drive home felt different this time. There was still a heaviness in my chest, but now it was accompanied by a sliver of resolve. I couldn't control what had happened, but I could control what I did next. And right now, I needed to focus on getting through this one step at a time. When I got home, the house was quiet as it had been before. His truck was still gone. He hadn't come back yet, and part of me was grateful for that. I didn't want to face him, not yet. Maybe not ever. I headed upstairs and grabbed a suitcase from the closet, my hands surprisingly steady as I started packing. Just the essentials, just enough to get me through the next few days. As I folded clothes and tucked them into the suitcase, I caught a glimpse of our wedding photo on the dresser. The two of us, smiling and happy, caught in a moment of pure joy. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I didn't let the tears come this time. I couldn't afford to fall apart again. Not right now. I took the picture off the dresser and placed it face down in one of the drawers out of sight where it couldn't haunt me anymore. I didn't need to see that version of us, that lie every time I walked past. I needed to let go, to start rebuilding myself from the pieces of my life that still remained. Once the suitcase was packed, I zipped it up with a strange sense of finality. It wasn't the kind of closure I had ever wanted, but it was the only one I was going to get. I grabbed my jacket and my keys, pausing for a moment at the front door, taking in the house one last time. The life I had known, the person I had been in this place, it all felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. I stepped outside, locking the door behind me, and slid the key into my pocket. As I stood there on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against my face, I let out a deep breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I had no idea what would come next, no idea how long it would take to heal, but I was certain of one thing. I was leaving the pain behind. At least for now. The road stretched out in front of me, wide and open, full of uncertainty but also possibility. I tossed my suitcase into the car, got behind the wheel, and pulled out of the driveway without looking back. There was nothing left for me there. Not the love, not the trust, not the life I had once believed in. As I drove away, the weight on my chest began to lift just a little. I wasn't sure where I was going, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew I was going somewhere where I could begin again. Away from him, away from the lies. And maybe, just maybe, away from the heartache that had consumed me.